It feels like a while since the last time we actually made a map on this channel. So I figured we'd get back to the basics in a sense with this map here, which is called Fiti. So let's take a look and see what we've got for us. So all players begin on the same island, which is pretty heavily forested. And then over here we have the inner reef, which contains only shorefish, so fishing here will not be super efficient. Players start out with a transport ship here, and with that transport, they can potentially transport a villager out to the outside of the reef, in which case they can access the deep fish and have more efficient fishing ships. So in terms of resources, players only have a small amount of gold and stone available to them. And in order to access more of those resources later on, they would have to eventually transport out to these barrier islands. So there are a couple of barrier islands, each containing extra gold and stone, and they are all connected by these shallows over here. So ships can pass between the inner reef and the outer reef very easily. And then the relics in the map are all in the middle surrounding this little pagoda here. So let's get started in making this map. But before we get into it, I just want to preface this by saying that this map was made for the tournament Terra Nova Duos, which I recommend you guys to check out. And I never explicitly told anybody about the Moana reference, even though that's what gave me the idea for the map's name. So whoever updates Liquipedia, I appreciate you. All right, everybody, open your eyes. Let's begin. So we'll start off with the player setup section. And since players are going to be starting in a circle in the middle island, I'll just leave that as random placement. And then next comes land generation. Now, the majority of the map is going to be water, so let's try to start off the base terrain of the map being DLC water 5. So that turns our map into water. And in the land generation section, we are going to need two major things. We're going to need the player lands, which are going to be the island in the middle, and we're going to need the barrier islands on the outside. So for the barrier islands, it's not very difficult to grab a circular pattern of lands if you have Tool-like Madlands. So we have 8 lands, 200 tiles. So if I take these, we can see we're trying to apply a base elevation to these lands, so we're going to have to put an elevation generation section in the map. So now things look like they're elevated properly. So we can see that we have a pattern of 8 lands, and this is just a template for us, and we can modify it any way we like. So for example, right now we have it so that these lands here at 90 degrees and 0 degrees, these are a bit too close to the edge of the map for my liking. So if I want to offset the whole thing by 22.5 degrees, that balances out a little more. So I can just replace that pattern with this over here. And for good measure, I'm going to put in behavior version 1. So behavior version 1 usually is good for making sure all the lands will be of a consistent size with respect to one another. So it's slightly different. And now we can start to take a look at the player lands, which are going to be in the middle. So that land statement should be pretty simple. Create player lands. Terrain type, call it grass. We'll have it take up as much of the land as it can within specified borders. So we'll have top border 27, and then similarly all of the other borders will be 27. So now we have a nice looking land in the middle for the players. We'll refine this later when we start to put our objects in, but for now I want to think about how we are going to connect the outer islands to each other while not connecting them to the middle island. So let's take a stab at connections. So we'll try connection generation. So we will say create connect all lands. We'll replace terrain DLC water 5 with DLC new shallow. So just as a generic thing, this is what it's going to look like. So all the lands are going to be connected with each other. So this is a 4-player game, so it's going to connect each of these neutral lands on the outside to each of the 4-player lands in the middle, additionally to all the other neutral lands on the outside here. And now, let's say we do not want it to draw connections to the player lands. We know that the terrain type of the player land is grass, so if I say terrain cost grass is going to be 0, it means that we will not attempt to draw a connection to the player lands because the terrain cost of the player lands is 0. So, even though that's technically the case here, we're still attempting to pass a connection from this neutral land to all of the other neutral lands. And if we were, let's say, trying to draw the connection from this land to this land, the easiest way is going right through the middle here, which is kind of what's going on. So we can try to increase the terrain cost of water if we want. DLC water 5, we'll increase that terrain cost to 5, and we'll try to increase the terrain cost of beach to be even higher than that. So even though this kind of works, it's not super consistent in terms of the thickness all the way around. So it's really not a super ideal solution for us right here. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I usually don't like using connections to draw important things on a map in terms of things that are going to have really important functionality. They're usually pretty hard to control and usually pretty inconsistent, as we can see here. So to draw the connections between all of the outer islands, we're going to have to use a different method. So that's what I'll show. So we'll get rid of the connection section and we'll replace it with a terrain generation. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's just imagine for a second that this patch of desert wasn't here, that the entirety of the outside was a homogeneous terrain, and the only way to differentiate these outer lands is by the elevation. So let's see what would happen if we change these terrain types to DLC water 5. As we can see, nothing happens, and that's a bug where you cannot apply base elevation to a water terrain. So we'll try something else. Instead of having the base terrain of the map be DLC water 5, we'll call that beach, and then all of these lands can have the terrain type of beach as well. So now the entirety of the outside is homogeneous, and we are able to differentiate these lands based on the elevation difference. But since this is all homogeneous terrain, it helps us in a sense. So let's go over terrains and say create terrain DLC new shallow base terrain beach land percent 100 spacing to other types is I think 17. So I want it to be at the point where it's at least touching all of these lands. So that's overlapping here, here, and here. So that's looking pretty good. And then I want some other sort of terrain, which is not shallow and not beach. So I'll call it dirt. Create it on top of DLC new shallow. And the spacing to other terrain types is going to be 7. So now we have a thin strip of shallow that's connecting, overlapping all of the lands on the outside. And then if we want to replace this dirt with the base terrain of the map, so we'll generate beach on top of dirt. Now we should notice that we should be in a position to differentiate what should be land and what should be shallow based on these height limits. So everything above elevation 0 we can just cover up with beach again. So let's create some beach on top of DLC new shallow. We're going to need more clumps this time. And then we can add height limits. So everything above elevation 0 is going to be covered up by beach again. Now, the resulting base terrain of the map that we started with was DLC water 5. Now, I'm going to try to add that back in at this point here. So we're going to try to do DLC water 5 on top of beach, and we're going to make sure that only the beach at elevation 0 is going to be replaced. And when we do that, it's not super ideal in the sense that it covers the slopes of the islands with this water terrain. Now, this is a bit difficult to see right now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on the grid. So grid is on, and then also I want to cover up all of the beach with ice, because ice doesn't blend as well as beach, and it's going to be easier to see. Okay. So when we specify that our height limits are 0, 0, what that means is that this flat terrain that is surrounding the slope, you can see over here, that constitutes elevation 0, but also this first tile that is elevated also counts at elevation 0. It isn't until we get to the second tile over here that it registers this as elevation 1, and then this over here at the top is elevation 2. So we are currently occupying the first tile of elevation with our water. And there are a couple ways we can change this. So the first thing is, what I'm going to do is set flat terrain only, and spacing to other terrain types is 1. So when we add that step, we can see that water no longer generates on our hill, but we also have that this one tile of flat land, which is beyond the hill, is now occupied by ice instead of water, which we would technically prefer, but in this case, it's probably not such a big deal because this is going to be a beach terrain. So in the previous iteration, we saw that it transitioned from the water to the ice on this particular tile here. And now, in this particular iteration, we're transitioning from ice, or from water to ice, in this tile over here. So what happens if we want to transition on this tile here, the one right on the slope? Well, let's try that. So right now I'm going to not generate the water just yet. I'm going to generate this on the beach at height limits 1, 2 again. So now we're back to transitioning at this tile over here. So now when I generate the water again, I'm going to say generate everything on the beach, which is 1 tile away over here. And so it's in this way where we can start transitioning from the water to the land on this tile, the first tile of the slope. Now we can change the terrains around in a little bit, but I just wanted to point out that a lot of the time it's possible to make connection sort of things without actually using the connections section. And in this case, it helps us maintain consistency. We can keep generating our map, and we can see that the width of these connections is fairly consistent all the way around. And it also gives us some opportunity to decorate these shallows a little later on, as opposed to if we used connections, we wouldn't be able to mask any terrains on it, for example, because the connections happen after all the terrains have already been generated. So now I want to switch focus a little bit and focus on this area in the middle. It's going to be a rocky area where the pagoda and all of the relics are going to be. So if we're thinking about what we can do, we could try to do that with a terrain if we wanted. We could say create terrain DLC rock. And we can say we can generate on grass, and spacing to the terrain types can be relatively high. It can be higher than that. Now that gives us a nice area to put stuff on, but making this as a terrain has some disadvantages. For one, we cannot elevate it, and number two, we don't have any origin to reference to in order to place something in a very specific spot. So it would be better to do this up in the land generation section as opposed to terrains. So right after I create the player lands, I'm going to create another neutral land, and this is going to be terrain type DLC rock, and it's going to have fairly the similar properties. It's just going to have higher borders. So if I say 47 instead of 27, and I can say its land position is going to be right in the middle, 50-50. We can see that it creates our land, but and we would be able to elevate this and reference things to that origin 50-50. But the downside is that there's going to be this separation from the rest of the map by the base terrain, which is beach. Now, when we think about how to get rid of that, we can try things like increasing the border fuzziness. but that doesn't really seem to do the trick. Now, let's just say that instead of trying to change the border fuzziness, we switched the land percent to be 0. This is just to show something. So even though it generates a very awkward looking square here, we can see that the issue we had before where it was separated by beach is no longer present. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go to Madlands. We're just going to draw a circle that's comprised of squares. So, and then we're going to get rid of this land percent, so it'll take up all the area, and we'll call it land ID 1. So now it creates a nice circle-y looking land, and this land that we had in the middle, I can change its terrain if I wanted. So that land that is now looking like ice still has its origin at 50-50, so we can reference things there if we need to later on. So we'll change it back to rock, and then we can put some elevation on this. Base terrain, DLC rock. So let's scale by size, and then spacing, have that be 2. So we can put elevation on that, and we'll just go into the objects really quick. I think that's the ID for the pagoda. So we're going to place the pagoda on the land we specified, which is at 50-50, and we're going to say max distance to player 0, and that should be able to successfully place it right in the middle, which is looking pretty nice. And now the foundation of our map is in a pretty good spot right now. So now we can focus on the simpler things like adding forests and decorating the terrain a bit more. So I'm going to change this from ice to dark gravel. I'm just going to grab some of the decorative terrains from the official map. Okay, so now we can see that our forest is over here, and then this is decorated a bit with the gravel border and a desert looking interior. And the other advantage of making all these connections as terrains as opposed to connections is we can actually decorate it a bit, whereas we wouldn't be able to do this if we had made these as connections because, of course, the terrain generation section comes before the connection generation section takes place, so we wouldn't be able to do any of this decoration, which looks pretty nice. Now, one thing I would like to point out is that it's a bit easier to see on the mini-map than it is to see on the map itself, but there is one tile of beach terrain between these shallows here and the water here. You can kind of see it on the mini-map. Now, it doesn't look bad when you're looking at it at the map, but one of the downsides, if you happen to be aware of this, is that beach terrains are able to be walled. So in theory, if you wanted to, you could wall out the entire reef, and that's something we would prefer to avoid. So in this case, what we're going to do to prevent this is we're going to use building blockers. So we're going to put a bunch of building blocker objects on this beach over here, and in that way, we're going to prevent this walling from being able to happen. So when we want building blockers, first object we'll need is going to be object 605, which is a type 80 class 14 object. Building blocker 2 is 1654. We're going to have to effect amount upgrade object 605 into object 1654, and then we're going to effect percent set attribute of building blocker 1 radius 1 is going to be 50, and the same for radius 2. So this should make it take up one tile of space, and in the objects section we'll building blocker number 1 place a lot of these objects, set scale. So when we generate this, and now when we try to put walls along the beach, which is along the shallow, we are no longer able to do so, but it comes at the caveat that we also placed building blockers on the beach that was surrounding the player lands. So if we wanted to dock our island, now we can't do that because there's building blockers there. So that's something we have to fix also. So let's just grab an off-grid object. So before we place the building blockers, let's create these off-grid objects on the terrain DLC new shallow actor area radius 1, and so we can force these building blockers to spawn only around the beach, which is around the shallows. So if I say actor area to place in is 1, now we can't build anything around the beach, which is around the shallows, but around the main island we are able to place docks, and also around these barrier islands we are able to place docks also. Alright, so now the next thing I want to focus on is getting objects to spawn on these barrier islands. We said we wanted gold and stone here, and in order to make sure that each of the barrier islands contains an equal amount of resource, it should be fairly easy to achieve that. We just go to these barrier islands and give them all a land ID. So land ID, we've already used number 1, haven't we? So land ID 2. So since they all have the same land ID, we can just take this bit of code that generates gold and we'll place it on land ID 2. So 5 objects. And now we can see that when each of these barrier islands have the same land ID, it will place the gold pile on each of them so that there will always be 5 on each island. And we can do a similar thing for stone also. So we'll have an equal amount of stone on all the islands also, and we'll have 3 objects instead of 5. So that takes care of that, and now I think we can copy over some of the simpler player objects from the official map. So now we have most of the player objects taken care of. And what I want to focus on next is, we said at the beginning that we wanted all of the deep fish to be on the outside of the reef, whilst having in the inside of the reef only shore fish for the players to gather. So right now we can see that we have a mixture of terrains out here. So we have medium water, and then this azure water, and we don't have homogeneous terrains in the inside of the reef either. So we're going to need a way to distinguish between the outside and the inside. And the way I like to do that is by just grabbing another neutral land. So this is going to have the same terrain type as the base terrain, so that's going to be beach. And at the land position, it's going to be right in the corner. 1, 1, and it's going to have land ID number 3. So if I were to take an object, say snapper, which is deep fish, and I were to say place on specific land ID 3, well, let's see what happens. So basically, land ID 3 is all the way in the corner here. So it's going to only place these deep fish in areas which are not restricted by a restricted terrain. So since this ring of shallows here is separating all of the outside from the inside, it's in this way that we can isolate the outside to placing only deep fish. And instead of saying temp min distance group placement, I'll just have that as a strict min distance group placement. And then in order to get shorefish to spawn in areas other than the shore, we can use a second object, and we can just use snapper as a placeholder because we can get rid of this fairly easily. Make sure we remove place on specific land ID 3. But effectively what we can see here is that we're able to get the shorefish in a place which is beyond the shore by using it as a second object. And then if we want to get rid of the snapper, we can just say resource. So negative 225 will get rid of all the food in the snapper, only leaving the shorefish. Now, another thing to notice is that since the forest is quite dense here, players don't always have a very easily accessible path from their own base to their allies or enemies' bases, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But what I do want is to have players have pretty much equal access to whatever's going on in the middle here, so they have equal opportunity to get the relics. So like we can see, this player, for example, doesn't have a very straightforward path to get to the middle. So we're going to do something about that, and we're going to use connections to do that. So this connection statement is going to connect to non-player land. So if we think about what we have on our map here, we have non-player lands in the middle here, but we also have non-player lands on the outside. And we want to make sure that we are only making a connection from the player lands to the middle and not from the player lands to these outer lands here. And that's not very difficult to do. So if we just put a terrain cost beach 0, it means the connection won't attempt to pass through beach, and since all the outer islands are separated from the main island by beach, no connections will be drawn to the outer island. I think we have not defined road fungus. That is 75. So we can see that the connection that we've drawn is going to provide all players with a straightforward path to get from their base to the middle where all of the relics will be. Now, we can see that all players in the game are starting the game with a transport ship. And that's intentional right now, but the first iteration of the map didn't have a transport ship. It just started with just a normal scout. And when testing, I found out pretty quickly that there's really not much for the scout to do, since there's no extra turkeys to find, there's no extra deer to push, and you always know where the important relics are. They're always in the middle. So the scout was just basically doing nothing, and that's why I switched it from a scout to a transport ship. And the benefit of that is players now have an option to transport to the outer islands earlier in order to gain access to the deep fish sooner than they would otherwise. But that also leaves the problem, let me test real quick, that it's still kind of annoying to figure out where everything is, since it's not always the case that these rhinos are always within our LOS when we start the game, and it's kind of annoying to have to roam villagers around our immediate area to try and look for those. So the idea that I had was just to, at the start of the game, just reveal a larger line of sight around the player's town center so that all of their relevant resources would always be visible. Now, we can try to do that with a special object. We can try this flare, which is 332. So I'm going to do this. So if we say effect amount set attribute of a flare ATTR line of sight is going to be 15, so it's going to reveal 15 tiles around the TC. When we have our town center, we can say second object flare, and this should reveal 15 tiles around our TC, and we're going to have to test in a normal game in order for these effects to work. So when we start a normal game, we can see that if we just look at what's visible within our line of sight, we can see that the stone and the wood would not be visible when we start the game. But since we have that flare, object 332, to reveal 15 tiles around our TC, we can see those objects. But it's also important to note that 332 is the object that reveals your allies' TC when you start the game. So you can also see 15 tiles around your allies' town center, which is not necessarily bad, but it's just something important to know. But at this point, I thought I might try to be a bit fancier than just adding the flare. Instead of adding the flare, I can try DLC fortified tower. So when we have a second object of fortified tower, it reveals a very similar area around our town center over here. And since this was intended to be a bit of a water-focused map, having the tower actually helps in the way of making it so land aggression at the beginning of the game isn't going to be so strong, since the fortified tower has 13 range. Now, that may look pretty scary, but in terms of its overall damage output, it's actually less than a guard tower, so even though it has 8 pierce damage, it has a reload time of 3 seconds, whereas a normal tower only has a reload time of 2 seconds. So it's helpful, but not too strong. And if we wanted to garrison inside the tower for extra arrows, we can do that. And also we can click the side of the TC to garrison inside that if we wanted to do that instead. Now, even though we have for us a pretty nice map, one thing that it's not so difficult to notice after just a couple times of seeing the map played is it's really hard to maintain control of the outer islands because, for example, a tower is not really strong enough to withstand a lot of Castle Age warships, and then a town center obviously has only 6 range, whereas from the Castle Age onwards, all of the warships in the galley line will have more than 6 range, so it's not easy to hold it with the town center. Basically, what's needed to hold the outer island is the castle, and that's not super easy to get to when you only have a little bit of stone at your base at the beginning. So I was very interested by this idea of having a tower inside of a TC. So I started thinking, could it be possible for newly constructed TCs to attach a tower also? So let's try and explore that. So a couple of videos ago, we took a look at what were annex units. So a town center object 109 has a couple of annex units, and we took a look at this one, 890, which is the MTTC annex. So this is not used for anything other than the Tatar sheep bonus. So potentially, if we were to modify this, maybe we could get a fortified tower to spawn instead. So let's try something like is 890, and then we'll say set attribute of the TC annex ATTR dead ID to 1102, which is a fortified tower. In addition to that, so spawning a building as a dead ID will make it a foundation. And if I say ATTR creation time, if I set that to 0, instead of spawning a foundation, it will spawn a completed building. And since we're spawning this from the TC right away, we're going to remove this second object from the map script. So we can see that we've been able to attach a fortified tower to our town center. And if we construct a new TC, that MTTC annex will spawn another fortified tower, so that newly constructed TCs will spawn towers also, and that would make it easier to secure the outer islands. But even though that's nice, the location of this isn't really desirable for us because it's taking up the area we would want to have villagers working in. It takes away the, how should I say, the passable portion of the TC, whereas previously we had the tower in the middle, which wasn't obstructing the working space so much. So we need to look a bit further. So one tip I can give regarding annex units is that there's a couple different ways to look at this. So if you want to filter by buildings that have an annex, we can filter this annexes. And if we say AU, we can see all the different annexes of all the buildings in the game. And that can be a little confusing sometimes. So there's another way to look at it in the sense that every unit that is an annex itself will have the attribute of head unit. So if we say HU is something that is an annex unit itself, the head unit shows which unit it's attached to. So the special one that we're going to be looking at over here is this one over here, object 1649. And when we look at 1649, we can see its head unit is 619, and that's a town center. So if we go back to a town center, which is object 109, we can see that 619 is one of the annex units of a town center, and this happens to be the solid portion in the back here. So object 109 annexes 619, and if we take a look at 619, 619 will annex a trophy, and this will be a bit more centered, closer to the solid portion, as opposed to the open portion over here. So instead of upgrading our empty TC Annex 890 to a fortified tower, we will upgrade 1649. Now 1649 normally has hit points, so for this to work, we must set HDR hit points to 0 so that it dies instantly and then respawns as a tower. So when we do that, we can see that the slot which would normally be reserved for a decorative trophy is now replaced with a fortified tower, and now it doesn't obstruct the working space of the TC. It still allows villagers to work here under the TC and allow them to garrison inside the tower also. Now, the drawback here is that the position of this is weird, such that when you ungarrison, villagers can't actually get out. So it's not very hard to fix that. We just need to increase the radius of the tower slightly. So a fortified tower is usually just a 1x1 object. So increasing the X and Y radius to 1 would make it a 2x2 object. So now the radius of the tower is going to be slightly bigger. And it's going to allow us to exit the tower when we ungarrison. And then, obviously, since each newly constructed TC will annex the trophy slot, each newly constructed TC will attach a fortified tower in a very nice looking place. So the final result of this map took a lot of little tidbits of information to get it to where it is now. And in some form or another, these have all been things that I've mentioned of sorts in previous videos, but it isn't always that often that they all come together to form a nice looking map. But when it does, it's a wonderful thing to witness. And with that, guys, what more can I say? Except you're welcome. And thanks for watching.